In the summer of 2020, my friends, Alex and Violet, and I decided to go on a mountain vacation. COVID cabin fever had hit us hard and we were desperate to get out. We settled in a mountain estate and planned to camp and hike at several different locations. For one night we thought it would be fun to book a cabin in the woods. Violet's parents had rented a fire tower once and loved it, but a cabin beside a fire tower was all we could find. It was cheap, clean, and secluded. Excited to have a night where we could be as obnoxious as we wanted, we booked it. In the weeks leading up to the trip, we decided it would be a great idea to drop acid at the cabin. Violet bought an entire sheet in preparation for our arrival, and it was tucked in her bag as we pulled out of the driveway to make our way to the cabin. I remember this knot in the pit of my stomach, this aching feeling that gnawed at me. I told Alex and Violet that there was no way we could drop acid that night. Violet was pissed. We turned around and got into a massive argument, but I stood my ground. I just knew that we had no business tripping that night. Finally, the fireworks settled and we were off. The cabin was roughly 30 minutes away from the nearest town. It sat atop a mountain. We held our breath as we rounded the busted road that spiraled toward the top. There were no pull-offs, no other campsites. Just a long, winding road that led us to the cabin at the peak. We settled in and started a fire to keep warm. As dusk gave way to night, we heard the unmistakable noise of an engine on the road, then the flash of headlights. A side-by-side with 3 kids arrived and our nerves settled. They smiled, gave us a wave, climbed the fire tower, and left. We'd heard there may be occasional visitors to the fire tower, but they were the only ones who'd come by. We doused the fire and moved inside, heated some hot dogs until they were lukewarm, ate them fast, and sat in silence. You don't know how quiet it is until you are in the middle of nowhere. You can hear every rustle of the leaves, the whisper of the wind through their branches. You get so used to white noise, living in the city, there's always the hum of an air conditioner or the dim roar of traffic to focus on. Here, the closest thing to white noise was the sound of our own breathing. We jumped at every noise, too frightened to speak to one another, and finally, I'd had enough. I cracked a few wine coolers, passed them to Alex and Violet, and slapped a board game down on the table between our bunk beds. It didn't take long for us to loosen, and we were laughing, having the raucous good time we'd envisioned. Much soberer than we'd thought, but enough that we were able to ignore the rumble of the woods. Later, we'd all recall hearing noises in the background. The snap of a twig. The dim rumble of an engine. None of us wanted to rupture the air of nonchalance between us, so we ignored it. Until a human hand reached up to the window between us and slapped it 3 times. We were screaming in an instant. Alex called 911, put them on speakerphone, and handed his cell to me. He grabbed pokers from the fireplace and passed them out. Violet started calling family members and saying her last goodbyes. I held my breath and listened for any more noise. Whoever this was, whatever this was, would have heard us call 911, and now they were being careful to make a silent retreat. Dispatch arrived 20 minutes later, a lucky thing for a 1 a.m. emergency call, and had their dogs comb the mountain. Nothing. They suggested it may have been a bear, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't believe that for a second. We'd barely cooked those hot dogs, and why would a bear smack the window by a couple of screaming kids rather than the one closest to the pan we'd used to cook? Why would a bear knock on the window like a human? Why, when we screamed, did the bear make a stealthy retreat? They had no answers. But they had one anecdote. As they'd sped to us, they'd come across a car at the base of the mountain, but that was the only sign of life they'd seen. I remember my blood ran cold, but Violet and Alex were too frazzled to absorb the weight of what they'd said, and dizzied by a new horror. Violet's car, thoroughly dusted by our drive up the mountain, was covered in handprints. Handprints that didn't match ours, that touched places we hadn't. We grabbed our shit by the armful and threw it inside, eager to remove every part of ourselves from this mountain. We followed the police, grateful every pothole found us further and further from that wretched cabin. We made it down in record time and found lodging at a seedy hotel that reeked of cat piss. I couldn't sleep. The thought of that car on the road rang in my head. Remember, there was nothing else on that mountain. It was a narrow road to the top, no pull-offs, no other campsites. There was the fire tower, maybe a visitor decided to spook us during their late-night excursion? But the kids from earlier. We'd seen their headlights. Whoever did this had stopped their vehicle further down the road and hiked the rest of the way. They didn't want to be spotted. They wanted silence and secrecy. Whoever this was hadn't been looking for a cheap scare, they'd planned this. I don't think I'll ever know what the person on the mountain wanted from me. I don't know if it was a practical joke or the beginning of a night of terror. I'm grateful for Alex's quick wit in calling 911. I wonder if our visitor knew we had service? It had certainly been a welcome surprise to us. Perhaps that was a wrench in his plan, enough to spook him before he could make things ugly. In truth, I don't know if I want to know. I think I'm just content to say midnight stranger. So my family owns a cabin on a small lake up in New Hampshire. We go there every summer. It's basically our home away from home. There are other houses on the lake, quite a few near us, but beyond that, it's a pretty rural area. Miles of woods stretch beyond the lake houses, so there's really no reason to be in the area unless you were hunting, own a lake house, or were visiting the lake for whatever reason. So one night, maybe 6 years ago, it was late, probably around midnight. My ex and I were lying in bed just chatting about whatever. All of a sudden we hear footsteps outside the open window. The window lays only about halfway up on the wall to the side of the bed and is situated so that it opens right at the bottom of the bed where our feet are. The ground around my house is covered in a layer of pine needles that drop from above, so it's pretty hard to walk quietly. But the footsteps sounded like whatever was making them were trying their best to not be heard. They sounded relatively close, but we rationalized to ourselves that they were probably made from some sort of animal. A couple of minutes go by and we hear them again, except this time they seemed closer. They seemed to be right outside the window, still trying to move quietly. At this point, the two of us are starting to get a little freaked out. To our mutual horror, we look down and see a hand slowly coming through the window. Obviously, we screamed and woke the house up, and my parents came running out of their adjacent room. We tell them what happened, and my father rationalizes it as the event being a figment of our imaginations. To this day I don't know if he's right. The weird thing is that both my ex and I saw the same thing, so how could it be our imaginations? To this day I feel uneasy staying in that room, and I always make sure to shut the window before I go to bed. Growing up, my brother and I were adopted into a family of 8 around the time I was 4 and my brother was 6. I would say it was a fairly normal adoption, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The family that adopted us lived in the PNW, Pacific Northwest, and they had a property of around 70 acres with nothing but woods around. The cabin they built is quite literally in the middle of the forest. You have to drive a considerable amount of time, 30 to 40 minutes to get to the nearest town. On this property, my family built several shop buildings to store wood for the cold seasons and to hold random equipment or machines. These buildings were spread all around the property. Some of them are even older than the cabin my father built, only held together by old rotting wood and rusted steel. They always seemed to give off ominous vibes. You could oftentimes feel something watching you if you ever went into them alone, and even with other people sometimes. I give all this context just to give you perspective on the size of this property and the feelings it gives off. This particular experience I wanted to share today started on a night in the late summer. I was around 11 years old at this time. The evening was slowing down as I lay in the grass on the lawn outside of the cabin. Feeling a breeze pick up and observing the sunset, I decided it was time for me to head inside. I got inside and brushed my teeth. I then headed to my mom's room to say goodnight to her. After that I went to my brother's room to say goodnight. We joked around and talked for a little bit before I headed off to bed. As I was stepping outside to go down into the cellar where my room was, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me. I quickly observed the deafening silence that accompanied this feeling. It was odd for the woods to be quiet at night, especially in the summer. You'd expect to hear the crickets and croaking of frogs, but there was nothing. I noted this, and with great haste, I ran down to the cellar. I kicked open the cellar door that was made of solid oak slabs. It was the most efficient way of opening it because it didn't have a traditional door knob. I ran inside my bedroom, slamming the door behind me with such a force it shook my room. I hate when that happens, I said aloud to myself, referring to the feeling I was just forced to feel. Deciding to try to calm my nerves down a little, I started singing some goofy little tune, not knowing what was going to happen in a few moments. I took off my shirt to put on my nightshirt and then hop into bed where I would think I was safe from whatever was peering at me. As I was walking towards my bed, only 2 paces in front of me there was a snapping pop in midair. Taken aback and quite frankly on the verge of sharting my pants, a figure appeared with the pop. Right in front of my eyes stood this being, pitch black, like he was hiding out in a chimney his whole existence. His eyes were void of color or any human emotion or expression. I'm not quite sure how long he and I just stared at each other. It could have been 2 seconds or 10 minutes because it felt like a lifetime. The absolute terror as I looked into this thing's eyes ate me up. It was like staring at something you know could kill you in that second but is choosing not to. Something with such emptiness that all that is there is just a void. Feeling as though my soul was violated, I scrambled to run for the door. Grabbing the door handle, I swung the door open. As I was making my bolt out of the cellar and into the dark, I looked back and saw it staring at me with those empty eyes. I ran with swiftness across the gravel on my bare feet until I got to the back door of the cabin. I ran inside to my brother's room, sobbing and shaking uncontrollably. The first thing he said to me was, "Did you see a ghost or something?" But quickly coming over to comfort me. He still says to this day that he has never seen me or anyone else look so horrified. After he was able to calm me down a little bit, we decided to go tell my parents. They were both super Christians and my father was to the point of being cult-like. I told them I saw a demon, and they saw how shaken up I was. But quickly they both denied it, completely dismissing whatever I saw. They never brought it back up to me after that night. My parents were gracious enough to let me sleep in one of our guest rooms for the night, probably because I refused to sleep in my bedroom after that. Nothing more happened that evening, besides me tossing and turning wondering what on earth just happened to me.